I'd like to introduce Bill Gent. Bill will be talking about some of the research that he's done on Mosque supplementary schools in London. After 15 years of teaching in Birmingham, Bill spent 20 years as a school improvement advisor in Outer London. During this period, he developed a relationship with the local Muslim community, a relationship that allowed him to carry out fieldwork for his University of Warwick doctoral thesis, which was titled Muslim Supplementary Classes and Their Place Within the Wider Learning Community, a Redbridge-based study. He now works as an independent educational consultant and edits Resource, the Journal of the National Association of Teachers of Religious Education. He is an Associate Fellow at the University of Warwick Institute of Education. And now I'll hand it over to Bill so he can tell us some more about the research.
Thank you, Esme. I hope it's a bit more spontaneous than that at the end. And now, please, I'm a very vain person behind this very shy exterior. My wife has a slightly different theory. And I should say thanks in Welsh, which I think is diolch. And I've spelt that D-E-E-O-C-H, which I don't think is like the Welsh word. Do we have any Welsh speakers here? No, that's not right. But it sounds... My mother was Welsh, so I'm sure I've got the accent right. I'm going to go at speed over the 40 minutes because there's a lot of ground to cover, and with any luck, it'll hide my ignorance too if I move at a fair pace. I'm saying ignorance quite candidly because, as I began to find when I began to look at the world of Islam, education and learning, it's a huge field. It touches on the very nerve at the centre of Islam. And so I don't profess to be an expert in Islam as a whole. I'm here this evening to talk about some of the research. I'm very conscious, though, that there are so many shades and meanings which I still have to learn about. There's something about the notion of hidden worlds which I think is quite appealing, perhaps, when you think of novels, when you think of psychoanalysis, perhaps, when you think of exposés and detective murder novels. They're all about making sense of that which is behind the surface, is hidden, whole new worlds. And you heard from Asma that I worked in northeast London, a borough called Redbridge, 250,000 population, a large Muslim community, the sixth of all the London boroughs, the 12th largest in England. And this photograph is taken opposite the teacher centre, where as an advisor I would often meet with teachers, do some inset work, but it was the centre of my life. In fact, the office block where I worked is there, behind that building. Perhaps we should have a moment of quiet reflection looking at that, a bit of awe and wonder. Fourth floor. And but often when I was going to and from the teacher centre, I would, at the end of the day, of course, this is about 6:30, 5:45, I would find this particular building, which I knew was a mosque, didn't know too much about it, with floods of children, boys and girls, coming out dressed in a particular way. And I knew by that stage, of course, that education was key for Islam. I knew that most religious and cultural communities did supplementary work in education, but what was going on, what were the dynamics of it, the language, I had very, very little clue. So this evening I wanted to say a little bit about my own work in that particular mosque. We'll come back to a photograph in a moment. It was ethnographic field work. Most of you will know that means writing about people, and it's often said about ethnographic field work that it creates thick description. So you can get lots of thin description about things, lists of hours and people and content. What it means in people's lives, though, the dynamics of it in people's lives, the colour, the taste, the flavour of it in people's lives, this is what ethnographic field work is particularly geared towards, and certainly was in my experience. So let's move off. First of all, a short a comment on the term supplementary classes. There are a lot of terms about non-mainstream education, whether Islamic or not. Supplementary classes generally these days in local government literature and so on means those classes which run parallel to mainstream schooling. And there are many, many sorts. And historically in Britain, Sunday schools would be a classic example of supplementary schooling. Language classes. I know in Redbridge, for example, the Hindu community ran classes in Hindi, Punjabi and so on, with GCSEs often, for children who wanted to go to those. Those also would be an example of supplementary classes. The particular type of supplementary class I became interested with because of my research was those that were attached to mosques. So that's what the main focus is this evening. Some confusion of terms, and I'm not sure whether I've grasped the nuances of all these terms properly, and indeed they are often used irregularly. But the particular mosque I went to, more about that in a moment, called its totality of supplementary classes a maktab. But this was a particular community with historical cultural roots in Gujarat. It's so easy, isn't it? Well, it was in North London to associate Islam with the Southeast Asian experience, particularly Pakistani, Bangladeshi. We forget that Islam's a worldwide phenomenon, and therefore the terms that are used will often depend on the cultural background of people using it. The word madrasa, though, is very familiar to non-Arabic speakers. I was looking at the Times today. You'll often find things these days, won't you, about Muslim education, whether explicitly stated or implicitly hinted at in the press. And Ed Balls, the Secretary of State for Education, was there talking about Ofsted inspectors doing some work in independent schools, faith schools, including madrasas. So this is the word that's often used in the press these days. I think if you look at madrasas in the Pakistani background, for example, they can often have a very different flavour. A madrasa often is, in fact, almost like a college of higher education after the maktab. But it depends on the cultural group you're speaking to. In Britain, and Sophie, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, we do have many mosque supplementary classes. We've also got colleges of higher education called Dar al-Ulum, houses of knowledge, and we've also got Muslim colleges too, like the one at Markfield outside Leicester. We have a whole panoply of different things. The terms that people use will often differ, though. Does that make sense? There's no constancy, I think, in that. Redbridge, North East London, that's where I spent a lot of years of my life. So, as I said, a large Muslim population, 28,000 in the 2001 census, very multi-ethnic as a whole. And bearing in mind the way that the British Muslim population is weighted towards the under 16s, you won't be surprised to hear that in primary schools in Redbridge at the moment, a third of our pupils come from a Muslim background, even though the proportion of the total population is far less. Some of the primary schools in Redbridge at the moment are 68% Muslim. So interesting dynamics occurring in those schools. Most of the Muslims in Redbridge came from the Indian subcontinent, but increasing number from Eastern Europe, Bosnia and so on, Somalia. Very, very little written about these, known about these. And I remember when I started my research on the Muslim community in Redbridge, I realised suddenly that in fact the geography of the Muslim community was hardly known at all. Very, very little research acknowledged that there was that presence, but how it worked and fitted together. And of course people use the fiction, the Muslim community. Indeed, there were many, many Muslim communities in Redbridge, but what the shifting dynamics was between them, I don't think anybody has looked at closely. So the opportunity to take my interest further came with starting a doctorate in education at Warwick University in the year 2000, and gradually you had to focus down on ethnographic field work. Well, it had to be something to do with education because of the nature of the beast. Back to this picture. Here we had the opportunity to do some digging around. I felt there was a hidden world there, and I perhaps would have the opportunity to look at it. I was lucky to be based at Warwick, of course, because it's famous for its ethnographic fieldwork. So with people like Professor Bob Jackson and Eleanor Nesbitt and people like that, there's a strong pedigree in that work that I could gain from. The particular mosque then is in Balfour Road in Ilford, and my background reading told me that it was largely of the Deobandi tradition. The literature says that if you look at the Southeast Asian community, or the Indian subcontinent community of Muslims, they will often fall into two categories, Barelvi and Deobandi. The Barelvi, the literature tells you, is largely Pakistani form of Islam, steeped in Sufism, in pirs, in saints, in traditions, in festivals and so on. The Deobandi, named after a Dar al-Ulum, a theological ceremony not far from Delhi in India, which began in the 1860s, is much more of a Puritan form of Islam. They saw their raison d'etre from its early days, as I understand it, as purifying Islam from some of these, what they began to see as cultural accretions. So it turned out that this was a Deobandi mosque. In the history of mosques in Redbridge, I had to do some work on. In fact, it was originally joined to a Barelvi community, and the two split. Again, my reading told me that if you look at the history of mosques in Britain, you'll often find that splitting away as communities become larger, more prosperous, and more settled. So I decided that that would be the one I would do my research in, and I wanted to find out what other research had been done. Much to my surprise, I found a little bit about British supplementary classes, references, odd short articles, lots in the papers, as even more so now, but I could find nothing in the nature of ethnographic fieldwork, nothing that told me the inside story. Indeed, when I looked at books on Muslim education, often they seemed obsessed with Muslim mainstream education. And you'll know in the last 20, 30 years in Britain, there's been the gradual story of Muslim schools coming under the state sector, becoming voluntary aided schools. That school in London, Cat Stevens School, what's it called? Islamia School, being the first to go down that route. But very little about what was happening in mosques in the evenings. Hardly any reference. I also was very interested in to see whether I could find any novels, any imaginative literature, any biographies about it, because I didn't want the figures. I wanted to know what the dynamics was. What was the inner tune? What did people feel as they were going through this process? And at that stage, and I still haven't found any more, this book by Sheikh Hamidou Kane, written in early 1960s, based in Senegal. He was a Senegalese Muslim French speaker, was the only novel that I really found, and still. An extraordinary, it starts, the opening scene is of the main focus, the main character in the book, sitting around a sacred hearth, what they call it, learning the Quran, not understanding the words, but understanding the beauty. And he gets the words wrong, and his teacher hurts his ear because he's profaning God's name. So I thought, well, this is interesting, corporal punishment straight away, and so on and so on. But that gave me a beautiful feel, I think, almost a unique feel for what the inner dynamics of going through this process might be like. Okay, so far. Right. I also found virtually no information available, no accurate information about facts and figures. I mean, how many maktabs, madaris is technically, I think, the plural for of a madrasa. And in the literature, and I found some people saying 700, some people saying 1600. I mean, there's no fixed figure there. The number of children attending mosque supplementary classes on a weekday evening, well, the figures I find quoted were between 200,000 and 400,000. But note, a substantial figure. I mean, we worked out, certainly in Redbridge, well over 1,000 of our pupils in our schools were going to mosques for 2 hours each evening, equivalent to probably a day and a half, even 2 days of their mainstream schooling. On top of that, now obviously some of the tensions and antagonisms begin to emerge at that stage, as they do for many Muslims too. The key issue was accessibility there. I remember when I came to see Sophie here in Cardiff 3 or 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, when my beard was slightly less white and you only had 2 children instead of the 12 you've got now, whatever it is. Sophie, was it 14? I remember the thing she asked me was, because I'd started to write up some of the findings, she said, but how did you get in? And I said, well, I just did, because I knew someone. And I hadn't realised, very naively at that stage, because I'd worked so long in Redbridge, I think, I didn't realise that often the problem was, how do you get in? And some research projects have been set up to look at Dar al-Ulum and these sorts of places, and they haven't managed to go much further because of that issue of accessibility. Well, I was lucky because this man here, this was taken for the Daily Express, this photo, isn't the internet wonderful? Last October, Imam Haroon Rashid Patel, I'd got to know him over many years, one of the imams of the particular mosque. He represents the Muslims on the Standing Advisory Council of RE, the SACRE, if you've ever heard of that, in Redbridge. Fascinating man. I got to know him, and we'd worked together in a position of trust. Born and bred in Britain, Gujarati background, Hafiz himself, he knows the Quran by heart. Native English speaker, obviously, because he is a British Muslim, but a Hindi speaker, a Gujarati speaker, Urdu speaker as well, because of his cultural heritage. And here he is with a local rabbi in Redbridge, because with my assistance, in fact, Haroon not only is now principal of the supplementary school at his mosque, he also does work outside the Muslim community. The Chabad, the Lubavitch, the Jewish Lubavitch movement, I don't know whether you've heard of them, they call themselves Chabad. Well, they run a drugs line, and he's a trained drugs counsellor who works with the rabbis on that. He also runs a community forum at a secondary school. And I'll say at this point, this is future research of my own, I think Haroon stands for the sort of what British imams might become at the best, serving their own Muslim communities, but also serving the wider community too. To use the jargon of age, giving value to both communities. So it was he who enabled me to get in. And of course it meant dealing with a mosque committee. I would say no more about mosque committees, but they are a very shadowy and a very powerful influence behind mosques. Muslims here, I'm sure, will be smiling to themselves. Often male-dominated, older generation, exerting a lot of power. But he knew how to deal with them. So said, can Mr. Gent come in? Fine. I hope you're not too dazzled by these moving words, I began to piece together, just from walking round the mosque with Haroon Rashid, what went on in the ordinary classes. I learned there were 300 plus students and a waiting list that goes to this particular mosque in the early evenings. Ages 4 to 17. The main class is 2 hours each weekday evening, with these 300 plus pupils turning up. I learned that the classes, you won't be surprised at this, were girls' classes and boys' classes. Remember, there's variety of cross practice here. I'm only talking about one particular tradition. As you saw in the pictures, white dress over their school uniform often. 16, 17 teachers there. Most of them native English speakers. Some of them, though, like a person I'll show you in a moment, not a good English speaker, but they were used basically for doing the Quranic recitation with the students. Those with good native English were used for the general classes. And when you went into the mosque, they were sitting in circles or like hollow squares. And I learnt there from my background reading that the halakha, the learning circle, which is said to go back to the Prophet Muhammad, is very significant within Islamic education. Indeed, the Muslim communities in Britain often have what they call learning circles, where people gather together, men together, women together, to talk about Islam. The curriculum I learnt focused on three sorts of things: learning to read Arabic, and these little books called Qaidas, become very significant in the lives of these young children, how to learn Arabic in order to begin to learn the Quran and to memorize some of the Quran, particularly which you recite in prayer and so on. Also Islamic law, fiqh, like the laws behind eating, washing, sleeping, those kinds of things. And also how to perform a pious life as a Muslim, how to perform wudu before prayer, and so on and so on. Notice I can only show you words. I can't show you photographs here because at this stage I was very conscious, self-conscious, walking around the mosque, and I didn't want to take photographs. It seemed to me look too local authority-ish, too councillors, too officious. And I was conscious at that stage that was on their territory, and protocols were important. Perhaps I should go back now and take them to show you. But also, two things struck me. Remember, a local authority advisor, also a school inspector, who for much of my time would be inspecting schools. So very much for me, a person inculcated in the Western academic tradition, educational tradition, for all its warts and things at the moment. Some things began to come to mind. First of all, I couldn't help beginning to reflect on the sound of learning. You will know perhaps that recitation, verbal recitation, outward verbal recitation, is a distinguishing feature of Islamic learning and education, as indeed it was in many other cultures. I mean, there's a fascinating book called The History of Reading, by a man called Manguel, a South African writer. If you ever want to look at the history of reading through all cultures. Interestingly, it doesn't talk about Islam, the Islamic world at all there. But don't forget that our own systems of silent reading and so on are very recent, historically and culturally. But the sound of learning, and it's funny because as an inspector and as an advisor in local authority mainstream schools, I would then go into some classes and say, I'm interested in the sound of learning in this class, and people used to look at me, as they often do, you'll understand, but because it's not something people thought about. And I began to realise too that I was beginning to move into a culture where orality and aurality, speaking, listening, had a far firmer cultural place than the Western secularised world in which I was moving in my professional job. The role of personal transmission, clearly very significant. This idea that the teacher who knows, who understands, can pronounce the words properly, more of that, is hearing the youngsters and making sure that they are learning and pronouncing the words properly. Very much like an apprenticeship model. You need a person for that. And significantly then, as well, and I continue to be fascinated with this, the way that adab and akhlaq, manners, character, associated with learning too. Recently published, 2008, you've got it on your book list, is a diary of a man called NATRE at a madrasa Darul Uloom actually, in northern India, his Diary of a Day. And again, I was fascinated. I just came across it at the mosque by accident, in the mosque bookshop. Wonderful, bearing what I've said, he's got an inside view. And what's extraordinary about Nadwi's work, wherever he talks about how beautiful a teacher or a scholar at the Darul Uloom was reciting the Quran, he always linked it to qualities of character. But a kind man, but a generous man. It began to make me think perhaps in the Western history, theory of education, we've rather separated personal qualities from the character of learning. In this little book, I waved the qaida a moment ago, it's got a notes for the ustads. Ustads, one of the titles used for the teachers. And it says, it's guidance to the teachers, respect for knowledge and those things related to it, e.g. the kitabs, the books, paper, pens, etc., should be explained to the child so that respect for knowledge enters his heart. So we have a sort of physicality entering the process of learning here, as well as an intellectuality, which I think has become the story of learning in the West, and certainly in the schools in which I was working. Walking round the mosque supplementary classes, many of them, I was introduced to two boys' classes which were called Hifz classes. Now, if the supplementary classes were hidden, this was even more hidden, the most hiddenest part. So I was already several steps from standing on that road outside at the end of the day, looking at the buzz of activity. The Hifz class. This opened up a whole new avenue for me, and I asked if I could then begin to do some quite detailed ethnographic fieldwork in a Hifz class. This was the class I chose. In an upstairs room, more than 2 hours each evening, and often for 45 minutes first thing in the morning before school. A group of boys with their teacher, not a confident English speaker. This Ustad, this teacher at the end here, came from Gujarat, lived in Kenya, and then about 15 years ago moved to Britain. So there are little hidden stories with each of these people too. Boys from, I think it was from a range of 7 to 18, met him, and their role was they had decided that they wanted to commit the entire Quran to memory. The process is called Hifz. A person who has acquired the whole Quran to memory is called a Hafiz. Okay? So as part of trying to understand why they were doing this, huge intellectual capital being exhausted, used in this enterprise, I had to do some background reading on the place of the Hafiz in Muslim society. I knew as a religious education teacher what a Hafiz was, but what their function was in Muslim society, what their role was, how they were regarded by others in a Muslim community, I had very little understanding of that. And again, it would be wonderful if I came across a book, The Diary of a Hafiz, to give me some feel for that. It yet hasn't been written, as far as I can see, or in English anyway. I also had to come across, of course, profoundly the nature of the Quran, because the Hifz class, the place of the Hafiz, are all intimately bound up with the nature of the Quran. And here I began to see once again my own limits as a Western scholar, as it were, a Western thinker brought up in the Western tradition. Because particularly in religious education, the dominant way of looking at world religions has been what's technically called phenomenology. Had its roots in the 19th century. And phenomenology is where you look at religions and you put them into themes, categories. And I don't know what your RE was like at school, but you might have had books with things like categories like festivals, sacred texts, you know, those kind of sacred people, founders, classic example. The trouble is, once you start to put the Quran under the category sacred book, you're straight away bringing with it all that Westerners think of books. A book is a printed text. A book is a printed text. And I discovered, I've got to go back one here. Let's be very clever. Can I go to previous? I don't know why that moved. Yeah. And I quickly discovered that, in fact, the dominant experience, historically, for Muslims, is as the Quran as living sound. It's not just a book. It's a sound. And more than that, the sound is a powerful formative influence on persons and society. The person that helped me to understand this more than any was this American scholar called Christina Nelson, who was a musicologist by training, went to Cairo 20 years ago, and actually herself, as a non-Muslim, began to learn the Quran by heart at the feet of some of the great Quranic scholars in Cairo. Cairo, the Cairene tradition of reciting the Quran, very, very famous throughout the world. And she says at one point, the Quran is not the Quran unless it's heard. That, for me, was a little window in which I began to see what the Quran was about. Then I had to learn more about the Quran too. This process of person-to-person transmission, absolutely central. The idea, and I do forgive me if I'm oversimplifying this because I'm still learning, the idea that if I, as a Muslim, go to my teacher and I learn to recite the words of the Quran, there's a taproot back to the Prophet Muhammad there. Because the Prophet Muhammad was given the words not to keep in the library, but to recite. Remember, Iqra, recite, Surah 96 of the Quran. He then recited those words, sound, to his followers, who passed them on and on and on. And of course, this idea of chains of transmitters is absolutely fundamental when you begin to look at the history of Islam. I've quoted in the book list there a book by Ingrid Mattson that was published last year, and she gives some fascinating, again, stories of American Muslims going across to Syria and so on in order to get an isnad, a certificate of transmission. So this is why then, in the mosque classes and in the Hifz class, the person-to-person encounter is absolutely central, the process of transmission. I began to realise that the science of recitation, tajweed, hope I've got the right pronunciation, is phenomenally difficult for a non-Muslim Western person to understand, and I would guess for a Muslim to understand too. The science of recitation, the different dialects, the different forms in which the Quran can be pronounced, the different language forms, see it written down, and it's phenomenally complex. And a great underlying debate about whether it's music. And then I had to think about the place of Quranic sound in Muslim culture and history. I hope this works.
The computer's turned down. Yeah, the volume.
Volume.
Excuse me.
I'm going to try something very clever.
Put the volume button up here.
Now what I've got in the middle there, see that little thing? Yeah. My daughter taught me this recently. If I click that, we should have Surah Al-Fatiha, the first surah of the Quran, being recited in the Maratal style, which is the style usually used for personal devotion. And at this point, thank you. Let's see if this works, shall we? At this point, I thought we should hear the Quran. No, it's not going to work, is it?
Is the sound file on the USB as well?
Might not be. Do we have any? Do we have a Hafiz here?
I can say it for you.
Would you like to?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
Stirring or what? It's powerful sound, isn't it? It's and thank you, Sammy, for doing that. When you look at some of the literature on this, you find that in Muslim history there are people who've become Muslim converts through hearing the sound of the Quran being recited. Nothing more. They've heard it, and it's something about it that strikes a root to the nature of reality or something. So I had to try to understand how that fitted together. I had to understand the dynamics of the Hifz class here. And I found that in fact it was based on children learning passages of the Quran, divided into 30, into siparas or juz, and then gradually, cumulatively, learning new ones, but then revising the back ones. Quite an extraordinary process. My fieldwork consisted of semi-participant observation. In other words, I was in the room watching, and then semi-structured interviews with 13 of the students during the process of that. And I took some photographs too at this stage. I found it very useful for to show the young people in Hifz class a photograph and say, what do you think's happening here? What was in that person's mind? What was in your mind? Why that look on your face? And so on. I divided the outcomes of it into 7 areas. Let me just touch very briefly on some of those. I found that the routes into the Hifz class were either through self-selection, students who something that they'd heard at home. One of them on Hajj had heard the Quran being recited, and he saw some reciters crying as they were reciting, and he thought, I want to do that, to recite it with that amount of feeling. And he came back and asked his father if he could go to the Hifz class. The father had a word with the teacher. He had a little interview, see whether his recitation was good enough, and he went in. Others, at the teacher selection, the teacher found they had a particularly retentive memory, very good at reciting the Quran. Was there pressure? All the children I asked said no, that there wasn't, because the very negative view often of mainstream school teachers, this was too much for children. They were forced to do this. What I found when they asked them about the pressure, they often said, our parents warned us. Once you start on this path of becoming a Hafiz, it's a lifetime thing. What about your schoolwork? So often it was the opposite, in fact. And I was amazed at the sort of self-discipline and the piety of these children. Routines and rhythms. Here we have people revising at the side. Then they come to the front, to the mat, have a quick glance at the little part of the sipara, juice they've been revising. Then in turn, they go before the curry there in order to recite and be corrected. Rocking motion. Can you almost just have to imagine this one? Fascinated by the rocking motion here. Find it in some other cultures too. And Christina Nelson said when she was in Cairo learning the Quran, she found somehow it aided memory. I remember I began to ask some of the teachers in schools, when your Muslim children are doing numeracy, do they start to rock? And some of the Muslim teachers said, we'd never thought about it, we'll look now. One section I did was about the sacrifice of becoming a Hafiz. Extraordinary feat, achievement, I think, to memorise the Quran by heart. And not only that, but also being the embodiment of the Quran. So it implies a certain intensity of character. And it also means you've got to go on, once you become a Hafiz, keep practicing for things like Taraweeh prayers during Ramadan and so on. There are various parts in a Muslim's life where the Hafiz is called upon. Some concluding thoughts then. From this process, I felt I was personally enriched by the process. I was extraordinarily impressed by the character of the people, teachers and the students that I met. Very little, if any, cynicism, generosity. As soon as I walked into the mosque, it was in the summer, there would be a drink ready for me. Just these small courtesies. Extraordinarily enriched by that encounter. But challenged. And I dare say you'll be asking about this. This whole process of learning the Quran without understanding the words, which Western educated people find so incomprehensible, because why read without the understanding? I began to challenge that in my own thinking too. A man called Anton Rosowski, you've got his name in your book list there, on a recent book on liturgical literacy, his phrase, draws the parallel, in fact, with opera. And he said, if you look at some of the great opera singers, he quotes some biographies of some of the great opera singers, when they learn, for example, the libretto of a Russian opera, they might only have a very hazy idea of what the words mean. But we don't sit and listen to them sing and say, rubbish, they don't understand the words. Because in the process of repeating the words in sound, in the context of the history of opera, it makes some kind of sense. Rosowski also, and this is something I'm exploring with some teachers in Redbridge at the moment, began to find from his own experience of being a teacher that he found that often Muslim children schooled in maktabs were often far in advance of their peers at decoding words. They could get the sounds very, very quickly, but their understanding of them was, we're not talking about Arabic here, but English words, was some way behind. And so he was beginning to look at the influence then of one's educational setting on the other. I began to explore whether in fact it would be of benefit for mainstream state schools and Muslim maktabs to work together. This is very much turning on its head the colonial mentality, which says this is maktabs are a rather primeval form of learning. The sooner they come over to the Western way, the better. And I began to ask questions, for example, in state schools where I worked, memorization was often very dominant in our system. Have we lost something in losing it? Is memorization as a form of learning still significant? And finally, now this is a question which I'm still asking myself, like the Imam I worked with, and I said earlier, could he be the model of a modern British Imam which gives value not only to the Muslim community but to the wider community? I just wonder, with the right sort of encounter, research and trust, whether Muslim supplementary classes too, in time, might turn into something which is not only good for the Muslim community, but also enriches the wider community as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was such an interesting talk. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If anyone has any? Please.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about this just now. So how can you change? Because all what you said was very interesting, but it's mostly what they do in mosques is theoretical, and this is what we have in mosques. They teach them the theory, but how do you change this from theory to practical side of our lives? I mean, that's the challenge.
Well, that is the challenge, and I think, in a sense, it's happening anyway, because I think as the British Muslim community evolves, as the leaders in the mosques and the maktabs become British-born, British-speaking Muslims, I think there will naturally be some sort of osmosis anyway. There'll be a lot more communication. I mean, maktabs often have been hidden because of fear of not wanting to be interfered with. People like me from the council and so on. In some parts of the country, local authorities have taken a lead though. In Leicester, for example, they set up something called the Complementary Schools Trust. Now, notice they chose complementary schools rather than supplementary schools, because they were looking at it from a positive point of view, saying these classes complement what's happening in mainstream schools. And there they were beginning to get people to work together. Often I found examples when I dug down of mosque schools and state schools that were fairly near each other geographically, beginning to work together, sharing professional development opportunities and so on. And I wonder whether, in fact, it's by this slow process that this will go on, rather than some sort of government intervention, which, as you know, is very dominant at the moment. I mean, there's a whole series of madrasas at the moment who are piloting material on citizenship. There's concern about the role of imams and so on. So I have no easy answer, but I believe that it's already starting to happen.
Yeah, can I just, another comment? Yesterday I read on the Times Online, there was an article about faith school. I know it's not faith school,
No,
it is,
no.
some sort of
Yes.
mini faith school.
Yes.
And they're suggesting that it's an obstacle for integration of
Yeah,
Muslim
yeah.
in British society.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
because I mean that's all what they give them, it's about Islam.
Yes.
It's not how to.
Yes.
It's not about integration. It's about differentiation.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
problematic.
I mean, there is a continuing debate, fierce debate, isn't there, about the value of faith schools. I mean, I think they're here to stay because of the history of British education. I mean, that's where that's where they come from. But on a separate research project, I'm involved in a national research project at the moment, looking at religious education resources used across the country. And I spent 3 days recently in another London borough at a girls' secondary school, which was 70% Muslim, 73% Muslim. Could easily have become a Muslim school. I found there an extraordinary openness and willingness to jostle, to talk about, to be open to outside views. So in fact, the complete opposite to this idea of hunkering down the hatches and just concentrating on your own faith. I found the Muslim girls I spoke with, they're open, articulate, willing to go and visit to other places, and excited intellectually by learning about other things. So it's not, I don't think it's necessary that a faith school will lead to narrow-mindedness. Depends on the ethos of the school, I think.
Sarah?
Yeah, I just had one question and one very short comment, if the chair will allow me. My question is just, if you had the opportunity of talking to the students themselves, that what sort of futures, rather in terms of careers, were they envisaging for themselves? Did you get a sense of that?
Yes, there weren't a whole range of things.
Right.
Yes, so they were.
So,
I mean, they weren't all. Of course, I wasn't looking at that, and I almost need to do a longitudinal piece of research now to find out what has happened to these people, I suppose. But no, I mean, they weren't therefore saying they wanted to become religious specialists.
no, exactly. Okay.
They wanted to be. They wanted to do a whole range of things. Yes, yes.
The other question is on the age. Were they very, from the photograph, it seemed that they varied in terms
The youngest was 7 years 1 month, and the oldest was 17 years 11 months. But in fact, 2 of the people in that class were already Hafis.
Right.
They'd already become Hafis, but they were starting the process of just keeping it going. So they used to come back to the Hifz class. Interestingly, you find in the Muslim literature and in conversations with Muslim, they're like hero stories of people who become Hafis. I mean, people tell me that there's a 6-year-old girl in South Africa who's recently become a Hafiz, and by enormous pride. And someone gave me an article about an 86-year-old English Muslim lady in the north of England who also became a Hafiz. So enormous pride in these stories. About how many Hafiz there are, one of the imams said that there are 7 million, but I mean, this is a symbolic figure, I guess, for lots.
Thank you.
So
some few questions, if I'm maybe allowed. One is from a professional point of view. In the mosque, if you take an example of the Hifz class, we had a varied ages from 7 all the way to 17, all being taught by one teacher. And from a professional point of view, how does that fit in? Whereby it's encouraging Western way of learning that age group, it matters a lot in terms of the productivity of the teacher, as well as acceptance of knowledge for the children.
Well, of course, all of the other classes were roughly age related, with continuity and a development between the classes. It seemed to me that these people had been brought together for a criterion that wasn't age related. It was because they had shown interest and they had a very adept memories, and it was for that reason that they were brought together. So I didn't see any clash with my other views of education.
Ellie, my brother, can I just move on to another question, please, and you can perhaps continue this later? Is that okay?
Over our meal,
Yes.
even better.
Jonathan?
Thanks, Bill. I enjoyed that very much.
Thank you.
Sorry I was late.
It's okay.
I'm very interested in what you said at the very end there about the implications for mainstream
Yes,
schooling.
yes.
You talked about
Yes, yes.
possibly reclaiming memorisation. I'm curious as to how that goes down when you say that to mainstream educationists, because I suspect, like a lead balloon, I'm curious because I mean it's not very trendy or popular in educational theory, is it, to talk about the importance of memorisation? So it's kind of really going against the grain. But obviously you work within the education system, so I'm sure you've had situations where you've tried to feed your findings in.
Yes, yes. No,
realistically, what is people's response?
You've got to bear in mind that in mainstream schools, they've been subject to huge change over the last 20 years. A lot of teachers in England are very frustrated by the politicisation of education, but still many of them are very open to new ideas. And obviously I try to pitch in carefully and subtly, but when I've spoken about these things, memorisation, people have often paused and said, well, oh, it's right. I mean, it's almost the English teachers are so engulfed by the welter and the quantity of modern innovations and projects that almost, when you talk about memorisation, it excites an echo from their own childhood and from their own background. And I certainly haven't found them saying it's not a useful form of learning. And many of the older teachers can recall that. I mean, again, in my own thesis, I did some work on memorisation, and clearly culturally, it's there very, very strongly. Many older people will talk with great joy about having a fund of remembered literature and poems and things in their minds. Remember Terry Waite when he was in prison in Lebanon? He was 6 years. Remember, what kept him going was that fund of biblical and other passages that he could draw on. So funny, and I remember watching a year 3 literacy class in a Jewish school where I was a school advisor some years ago, being taught by a New Zealand teacher, and they were looking at a poem, and I said to her in my feedback after the lesson about extension activities, which is the idea of those who've really got something and taste it, how can you move them on? Obsession with that in the English system. And I said, have you thought of inviting some of the people in your class to memorise the poem? An achievement. And she said, no, it hadn't dawned on me, but I will try. So it was often that. It wasn't part of the agenda, but often taken as a possibility still. Does that make sense?
Okay, one final question from Ali, if that's okay.
It's just a comment we've got to imagine between the madrasa system and the mainstream system. In one of my travels in Bradford in Stan, I actually came across a school which the headmistress chose she had a teacher who was a professional madrasa teacher as well as a mainstream teacher, and he actually requested him to merge the two systems in that particular school to the mainstream classes.
Right.
And the children who attend that class are completely appreciation of education has become completely different for the children who are being taught by the rest of the teachers. So maybe that's something we might want to.
It's funny. I set up a small experiment when I invited a couple of Muslim state school teachers in our schools who I knew. Asked them to go and observe some of the girls' classes at the NATRE, because I was wondering how mainstream teachers, trained teachers, they would react. Their response was interesting, but it wasn't damning. And one of them said to me, the thing which she would take back to her school was there was a sense in the class she was watching that they knew why they were there. When she went back to her own class in a mainstream school, there wasn't such a profound sense of that happening, and she was wondering how it happened and whether there'll be a state school version of that. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much everyone for coming up, and Bill for sharing some of his experiences with us. Just to remind you about the lecture next week, same time, same place. We'll have Nasser Mir talking about Islamophobia, real or imagined. And that's about it really. So can we just say thank you to Bill once again?